All right, this is Violence Prevention, Part 8. Violence Prevention Educational. And I am picking back up at universal access to free higher education. Education is one of the most powerful tools for acquiring self-esteem, and since self-esteem is the most powerful psychological force that prevents violence, it is not surprising that level of education is one of the strongest predictors of whether or not a person will be violent. A few years ago, my colleagues and I conducted a study to determine what programs in the Massachusetts prison system were most effective in preventing recidivism or reoffending among prisoners after they are discharged and returned to the community. The only one that we found to have been 100% successful up to that time was a program of free higher education that enabled prisoners to acquire a college degree. Over a 25-year period, more than 200 inmates, most of whom were serving time for the most serious violent crimes, including murder, rape, and armed robbery, had received a college degree and then left prison, and not one had been returned for a new crime. At first, I thought we had made a mistake and missed someone. Then I discovered that the state of Indiana had found exactly the same result, and so had Folsom State Prison in California. Not one prisoner who had acquired a college degree while in prison had been reincarcerated for a new crime. Now, nothing is 100% forever or under all circumstances, and the success rate for such programs is not that high everywhere. But many surveys have been done throughout the U.S. that have confirmed that higher education reduces rates of recidivism far more than could be due to chance, and far more effectively than any other single program. As a follow-up to our own study, we discovered that finally, some 30 years after the first inmates were graduated, 2 have been returned to prison. That is less than a 1% recidivism rate over a 30-year period, which compares to national recidivism rates of 65% within 3 years of leaving prison. Strictly speaking, free higher education for inmates is an example of what would be called tertiary, not primary, prevention of violence. But I'm discussing it in this chapter because I believe the principle it illustrates is relevant to the entire population, not just those who have already become violent. Where do we go from here? A century and a half ago, we discovered that cleaning up the water supply in the sewer system was far more effective in preventing physical disease than all the doctors, medicines, and hospitals in the world. What we need to learn during the coming century is that cleaning up our social and economic system by reducing the shame-provoking inequities in social and economic status will do far more to prevent physical violence than all the police, prisons, and punishments, and may I add, tanks, guns, and LRADs in the world. All the prison psychiatrists we could possibly hire, and all the armies, armaments, and Armageddons we could mobilize. There you have it. What is at issue here is relative poverty, not absolute poverty. Inferiority is a relative concept. When everyone's poor together, there is no shame in being poor. As Marx said, it is not living in a hovel that causes people to feel ashamed. It is living in a hovel next to a palace. And as he also said, shame is the emotion of revolution, i.e. of violence. But one does not have to be a Marxist or subscribe to everything he said. And by the way, revolution does not always equal violence, just for the record. I believe in revolution, and I do not believe in violence. But one does not have to be a Marxist or subscribe to everything he said in order to see how correct his insight was. Adam Smith, Amartya Sen, and other non-Marxist economists have seen the same things. In his latest book, Professor Sen, in Development as Freedom, 1999, emphasized how profound the psychological injuries are that are caused by unemployment and by relative poverty. These do not merely cause economic damage to people, they also wound them emotionally. Among its manifold effects, he points out, unemployment contributes to social exclusion, to losses of self-reliance, self-confidence, and psychological and physical health. And he reminds us that Adam Smith saw that economic inequality, relative deprivation in terms of income and wealth, can cause absolute deprivation when it exposes people to crippling and disabling intensities of shame. For example, he quotes Smith's comment that leather shoes are not a physical necessity, but they can be a social and psychological one, since anyone would be ashamed to appear in public without them. No one who has seen violent teenagers who will kill each other over a pair of sneakers, as I have, can doubt the importance and validity of what Professor Sen and Adam Smith are talking about. Shakespeare also saw the difference between absolute and relative deprivation, and how devastating the latter can be to a person's sense of his basic human dignity when he has Lear cry, "Oh, reason not the need, our basest beggars are in the poorest thing superfluous, allow not nature more than nature needs, man's life is cheap as beasts." But how can we go about eliminating relative poverty? Clearly, education is relevant and important, and making it freely available to everyone can only help. But that alone will not solve the problem. I say that because I have worked with the most violent criminals our society produces, and I've heard politicians like John Major in the UK and his counterparts in the US say that what we need to do to solve the problem of crime and violence is to teach criminals to learn the difference between right and wrong. In other words, we need to teach them to recognize the difference between justice and injustice and to pursue the former and eschew the latter. But what the politicians who mouth these sentiments do not realize is that the violent criminals are perfectly aware of the difference between right and wrong and justice and injustice. They realize that they have been victims of injustice, most of all from those who preach to them most loudly about it. And they commit their crimes in order to achieve some measure of justice by taking something back from a society that has subjected them to a degree of deprivation to which it does not subject others. And I've experienced this, and that was part of the taking over of my home. For example, how can we as a society say that we have something to teach about justice when we permit the perpetuation of an economic system in which some people inherit millions of pounds while most people inherit nothing? How can we speak of equality of opportunity under those conditions? Violent criminals are not violent because they are dumb, out of touch with reality, or unable to recognize hypocrisy, dishonesty, and injustice when they see it. They are violent precisely because they are aware of the hypocrisy, dishonesty, and injustice that surrounds them and of which they have been the victims. That does not mean that they respond to those conditions in a rational or just way, or that we should tolerate and permit their violence, which affects their fellow victims much more often than it does their oppressors. But it does mean that we cannot expect to stop the kind of violence that we call crime until we stop the kind of violence that I have called structural in Structural Violence, 1999. Obviously, that's another book that he wrote. By this, I mean the deaths and disabilities that are caused by the economic structure of our society, its division into rich and poor. Structural violence is not only the main form of violence, in the sense that poverty kills more people, far more people, almost all of them very poor, than all of the behavioral violence put together. It is also the main cause of violent behavior. Eliminating structural violence means eliminating relative poverty. So how can we do that? There's an old saying that the cure for poverty is money. Since there are two forms of relative poverty, inequities in wealth and in income, we will need to deal with both. Inequities in wealth can be dealt with during the lifetimes of the wealthy by means of a wealth tax, and after their lifetimes by means of an inheritance or estate tax, with the proceeds in either case distributed to those with less wealth. Inequities in income can be dealt with by means of a negative income tax, in which people whose incomes are below the cutoff point pay no taxes but instead receive money from the taxes paid by those with higher incomes, similar to an earned income credit. This strategy has been utilized on a small scale in the US, where it has been described by some scholars as being one of the most effective anti-poverty programs in US history, along with the Social Security system that has lifted many of the elderly and disabled out of poverty. It has several advantages over more traditional welfare systems, of which the one most relevant to our discussion is that it spares the recipients from the humiliation often attendant on visits to welfare offices. My point here is not that those are the only or even necessarily the best ways to alleviate the inequities in income and wealth that create feelings of injustice, envy, inferiority, and hostility, but simply to point out that there are ways to do it. They have been tried, and some of them seem to work. In principle, there is no limit to the degree to which income and wealth could be equalized. The degree to which we choose to equalize them could be decided on in part by another principle, which is that the more they were equalized, the lower the level of violence we would expect as a result. Ultimately, then, we would be left with the same question with which we started this discussion. How seriously and completely do we want to prevent violence? And how high a price are we willing to pay in order to do so? The choice is ours. There would, of course, be many objections to such a plan, especially from the wealthy. But there is one objection that might be worth discussing here, namely, that the more we equalized income and wealth, the more we would destroy people's incentives to work. That is an argument which, if you examine it more closely, is applied only to the poor, not to the rich. The traditional defense of class stratification and the existence of a leisure class, ever since the rise of civilization, from both Plato and Aristotle, as well as from the more recent social thinkers, is that a leisure class is needed in order to have the time and energy for the specialized intellectual development and technological skills that are necessary preconditions for civilization. And leisure class has always meant a group with a guaranteed income, i.e., those who did not have to work for a living. Then you see this in the fact that when we're stuck in survival mode, we're literally stuck in the reptilian brain, which is a block to higher thinking. Implicit in this argument is the assumption, which I happen to think is correct, as I think the history and development of civilization proves, that when people are freed from the necessity to work, that is, when work is freely chosen, rather than slavery or wage slavery, i.e. work or starve, they do not just vegetate in a state of passivity and dependency. Rather, they engage in much more creative work. So it's not that everyone would just become lazy and lay around. It would be that they would actually have access to do things that they really would like to do as work. And of course, they'd apply themselves much more thoroughly and passionately because they would be doing something that they really wanted to do. Coercion creates an incentive for passive aggressiveness because when overpowered and helpless, there is no other way to express the minimal degree of autonomy that people need in order to maintain any semblance of self-esteem, dignity, and pride. Furthermore, when work is a means to an end, working in order to eat, then it is, in Marxist terms, alienated labor. Labor can only be liberated from alienation when work as an end in itself entered into freely as the expression of spontaneous and voluntary creativity, curiosity, playfulness, initiative, and sociability. That is, the sense of solidarity with the community, the fulfillment of one's true and essential human nature as social and political animals, to be fulfilled and made human by their full participation in a culture. So to be able to contribute in the way that you feel passionate about contributing is so important. In short, the contradiction in the old defense of class stratification is that it defends leisure for the leisure class, but not for the underclass. With reference to the underclass, leisure is said to destroy the incentive to work, leads to slothfulness and self-indulgence, and retards cognitive and moral development, which is a load of crap. When applied to the leisure class, the concept evokes an image of Plato and Aristotle, whose leisure was based on slave labor, creating the intellectual foundations of Western civilization. Or patrician slave owners like Washington and Jefferson laying the foundations of American civilization, or creative aristocrats like Count Leo Tolstoy or Bertrand Earl Russell, or even closer to home, of our own sons and daughters, or of ourselves when we were young adults, being freed from the stultifying tasks of earning a living until well into our adult years so that we could study in expensive universities to gain specialized knowledge and skills. As we enter the new millennium, perhaps it is worth reflecting on the fact that this could be a turning point in the evolution of civilization, for our technologies have evolved to the point where there is no longer a need for an underclass of slave serfs and wage slaves. This division of society into a hierarchical order of upper and lower social classes did not exist until civilization was invented. The low level of technological development made this necessary to allow a class of specialists, mathematicians, inventors, poets, scientists, philosophers, the leisure for the creative work that is a prerequisite for the creation, maintenance, and further development of civilization. But slaves and underclasses are no longer needed in order to free up enough leisure time and energy for the elite to do work that is creative rather than alienated. Therefore, we no longer need social classes and their concomitant relative poverty and economic inequality and their concomitant violence. If we permit ourselves, and by ourselves I mean all of us, all human beings, to enjoy the fruits of the creative labor that has preceded us, we could create a society that would no longer need violence as the only means of rescuing self-esteem. Implicit in this argument is the idea that money is neither a necessary incentive, tongue-tied, sorry, a necessary incentive for creative work, nor the main incentive. The play that infants and children engage in is clearly an inborn, inherent trait of human beings. Play has been called the work that children do, the means by which they acquire the skills and knowledge that enable them to develop and mature into adults. Play has also been described, when applied to adults, as simply another name for work that one enjoys. We could use the word to refer to unalienated labor, creative work, work that is an end in itself. I believe that the wish and the need to engage in this creative work play is only conditioned out of human beings by the alienating conditions to which the underclass and even the middle class in our society are subjected. There's a large body of empirical research that is relevant to this. One category consists of psychological experiments reviewed and summarized by Cohn in Studies Find Reward 1987 that call into question the widespread belief that money is an effective and even necessary way to motivate people. Consensus has emerged from major psychology departments throughout the U.S. that creativity, interest, subjective satisfaction, persistence, and overall productivity all decline when a task is done for the sake of an external, extrinsic reward. The only sphere in which material rewards do seem to be necessary is that of the dull jobs that make very little use of their abilities. But that is precisely the type of work that is much less necessary now that technology has created robots and servo mechanisms. The time may have come to ask whether the price we pay in violence and unhappiness is worth the reward of keeping some groups of people in menial jobs that we could easily do without. Another relevant research program consists of studies investigating the degree of satisfaction or happiness that whole groups of people experience under differing conditions of income distribution. The consensus is that people located at every point on the status scale in the unequal income communities, whether at, above, or below the average, reported less personal happiness and subjective satisfaction than those in communities in which income was distributed equally. A third field of research has compared productivity in the U.S. with the relatively egalitarian welfare states of Western Europe. The consensus has been that productivity growth since World War II has been much faster in Europe than in the United States. But since someone dismissed this finding as showing that it is easier to increase productivity when you start from a lower base, as did Europe after the devastation of the war, it should also be noted that more recent data show that several European countries, including France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium, have matched or even exceeded the United States productivity levels. Wow. And among the OECD nations as a whole, Glynn and Miliband in Paying for Inequality 1994 have reported that those with the fastest increases in productivity tend to be those with narrower income differences. If all we were concerned about was preventing violence, it would not matter whether productivity diminished as wealth and income equalized. We would feel that preventing violence was so important that it was worth the sacrifice of some growth in overall gross domestic product. At least we would all be poor together and suffer less shame and less violence. But it is relevant in the real world to ask how high the price will be to society if we become more egalitarian. Violence is not all that people care about, though if it increases as much in the next century as it did in the last, preventing violence will turn out to be so important as to make all other considerations irrelevant. And as I read this, Trump is sending troops to Detroit to crack down on crime. So there's going to be a lot more people sitting in cells in the next weeks to come. Thank you. The most extreme evidence for that might be the experience of the third world countries. So as not to shame these states, they are now conventionally referred to as developing countries rather than undeveloped ones. This is little more than a cruel euphemism for many of them. The sad reality is not only that they are not developing but are actually underdeveloping, getting poorer. Is that because they are too egalitarian? On the contrary, by far the greatest degree of both economic inequity and violence in the world is found in the third world countries, whose populations typically consist of a tiny oligarchy of extremely wealthy rulers, a vast majority of starving peasants, and no middle class. In comparison, even the United States looks like a peaceful social democracy. If economic inequity were a prerequisite for economic growth, one would expect these countries to be growing by leaps and bounds. Instead, they are regressing. And that is because our country sets up puppet dictators, and the people are forced to work for slave wages in order for riches to be sent to our country and resources. And the people who live over there, their property is held carrot and stick from them. And how are they supposed to get it back? By being slave wage servants? No, it's not right. If we look at the group as a whole, we would have to conclude that the higher the degree of economic inequity in a society, the lower its productivity and rate of overall economic growth. Unequal societies are not only the most violent, they are also the least productive. Chapter 6, Secondary Prevention, Early Intervention. The secondary prevention of physical illness consists of identifying the individuals who are at increased risk of becoming ill, such as those with high blood pressure or elevated serum cholesterol levels, and intervening to remove, diminish, or neutralize the risk factor before they become ill. Exactly the same principles apply to the secondary prevention of violence. In this chapter, I will briefly summarize a variety of such programs that have been adopted and found to be effective. Secondary prevention, like primary, is more effective in absolute terms and also more cost effective, more benefits per money spent than punishment after people have already committed an act of serious violence. Even more importantly, the most significant help we can give victims is to prevent their being victimized in the first place. This is partly why it is so, in other words, if everybody wasn't so desperate and they had the basic things they needed, they wouldn't probably feel the need to stick anybody up for their life. This is partly why it is so important to shift the emphasis of our public investments concerning violence away from the current wasteful and ineffective overemphasis on police, prisons, and punishments, and toward early intervention before people have become violent. Some of the most rigorous research on the secondary prevention of violence is being conducted by the RAND Corporation of California. And the reference is Diverting Children from a Life of Crime, written in 1996. For example, they have been able to document the effectiveness of 2 programs designed to prevent the development of future violence in a demographic group that was statistically at increased risk, children of mothers who were young, single, and poor. The first program consisted of training for parents and psychotherapy for families with young children who have shown aggressive behavior in school. The second was a program of providing cash and other incentives to induce disadvantaged high school students to graduate. They then compared the arrest rates of these children over the years as they grew up with those of control groups that had the same demographic characteristics in order to calculate how many crimes the interventions had succeeded in averting. Finally, they compared the effectiveness of these programs with that of the 3 strikes law in California, which mandates a life sentence in prison for anyone who is convicted of a 3rd felony. What they concluded was that the 2 prevention programs reduced the crime rate by approximately the same amount that the 3 strikes law had, about 20%, but at only about 1/6 of the cost, and of course without having to imprison anyone. That brings us to another extremely important method of secondary prevention, governmentally provided support for parents with young children. One of the most powerful reasons that being born to a single mother in the United States leads to higher arrest rates later in life is because that family situation is so likely to be associated with poverty. For example, in the U.S. in 1994, 59% of children in single-parent families were living and all too often dying in relative poverty, as compared with only 13% of those living with 2 parents. Relative poverty is defined in this study as having 50% or less of the national median adjusted disposable personal income, which includes the benefits received from government welfare programs. That neither of those levels of child poverty is necessary can be seen by the fact that the U.S. rate of poverty among single-parent children is exactly twice as high as the average among 14 countries of Western Europe, including the UK, where it is at 29%. For that matter, the U.S. rate of poverty among 2-parent families is also almost twice as high as it is in Western Europe, 13% versus 7.5%. Why is this? One major reason is because virtually every Western European country provides family allowances for families with children, whether they have 1 or 2 parents. The effect of this policy and of all the other governmental redistribution programs is that the European social democracies succeed in reducing the rates of relative poverty among children by an average of 48%. From what it would be without these programs, whereas the U.S. reduces child poverty rates by only 13%. Preschool educational programs such as Head Start and the Perry Preschool program have also been shown to reduce later delinquency and crime, as well as having many other desirable effects. Some studies have indicated that taxpayers save $4 for everyone spent on such programs because of the rates of future arrests, imprisonment, unemployment, welfare dependency, and so on are so much lower among those who have attended preschool programs. Aw. They make them into good tools for the state. Good followers. One, pardon me. Education's a good thing. Once children are in school, programs teaching them how to resolve conflicts peacefully appear to reduce the rate of future violence. And despite the fact that some politicians apparently believed that the high-risk youths who live in the poverty-stricken inner-city ghettos were beyond salvation and therefore ridiculed the provision of supervised after-school recreational activities as so much midnight basketball, implying that they were a waste of taxpayers' money, the fact is that such programs have been among the most dramatically successful in reducing the rates of teenage crime and violence. Most criminal behavior among school-age youth occurs, not surprisingly, in the hours following the end of the school day, from 3 p.m. on. So targeting those hours as the time to provide supervised activities, coaching, and teaching in sports, music, art, drama, and so on was not only logical, it has also been successful. Children who witness violence in their families or neighborhoods are also at increased risk of becoming violent themselves. In order to prevent this from happening, a group of child psychiatrists and psychoanalysts at the Child Study Center at Yale, under the leadership of Donald Cohen and Steve Morans, have entered into a partnership with the New Haven Police Department, under the terms of which the police notify the center whenever a violent or traumatic incident has occurred to which a child was exposed, day or night. When that happens, a member of the center staff immediately goes to the site of the incident, interviews the child and other family members, and arranges for follow-up consultations and interventions as needed. The program is still being developed, and it'll be some time before it's possible to evaluate its success, but it certainly exemplifies a logical and innovative response to a type of situation that's well known to predict future violence. That program also exemplifies another innovative development in violence prevention, in which the New Haven police were among the first to implement community policing, i.e., training and encouraging police officers to develop ongoing relationships with the neighborhood residents for whom they work, getting to know their problems and learning how to help solve them proactively rather than simply waiting for a crime to occur and then reacting by arresting someone. There you go. This approach has been followed by declining crime rates in a number of different cities in which it has been tried. What is notable about it is that it redefines the professional role of the police officer so as to incorporate many elements of what traditionally has been called social work or community psychiatry, and it appears to be much more successful than traditional police practices. Child abuse is another well-known cause of increased risk of future violence. Two responses are important in order to reduce this risk: preventing the child abuse itself, and where that has not been possible, intervening so as to help children exposed to this type of trauma recover from it without going on to become violent themselves. Most developed nations have a child abuse notification system that mandates reporting to a central registry whenever doctors, teachers, or other adults become aware of a case of child abuse or have reason to suspect it. While child abuse itself has not disappeared as a result, on the contrary, the number of reported and substantiated cases has increased over the years, at least in the United States. The number of cases of fatal child abuse have declined by 50%. So it seems that the system is helping, at least in that important respect. In fact, both the reporting system and the widespread public education that is part of it have probably played a major part in that decline. But of course, merely reporting child abuse after it has occurred is not as desirable as preventing it. In that regard, it is relevant to know that fatal child abuse is 60 times more common in families with incomes under $15,000 than it is in those with incomes over $30,000. In other words, the more poor that you are, the more likely you are to be a victim of child abuse when you were a child. And virtually every other variety of child abuse appears to be much more common in the poorer families than in the more affluent. So in this context also, diminishing the inequity in incomes could be one of the most powerful means of preventing violence. providing home visits from nurses, social workers, etc., to mothers who are at increased risk of abusing their children, single, poor teenage mothers, to help them learn how to understand and raise their children, has also been shown to bring about significant decreases in the rate of child abuse. Mothers who have been abused in the past or are currently being beaten by their husbands or boyfriends are also at an increased risk of abusing their children. Therefore, providing them with counseling, psychotherapy, treatment for post-traumatic stress, or access to a shelter for battered women can help mother and also decrease the likelihood of her becoming violent towards her child. Drugs and violence. The last risk factor predicting increased likelihood of violent behavior is substance abuse. However, the reason for that correlation is widely misunderstood to mean that illicit drugs themselves cause violent behavior through their psychopharmacological effects on brain and behavior. In fact, the opposite is true. The source: Alcohol, Drugs of Abuse, Aggression, and Violence, and Understanding and Preventing Violence, 1994, Rice and Roth. Two of the most widely used illicit drugs actually inhibit or prevent violence. Their names are marijuana and heroin, and other opiates. People under the influence of these drugs are actually less likely to engage in violent behavior or otherwise identical conditions than people who are not under their influence. The effect of stimulant drugs, cocaine and the amphetamines, and crack on violent behavior is more complicated, but can be summed up by saying that they stimulate violence in some people, especially those with pre-existing borderline psychotic personality disorders who may become paranoid under the influence of these drugs. Inhibit it in others, such as children and young people with attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity and other problems, and have no discernible effect one way or the other on violent behavior for most people. And I would say that crack probably has the worst effect on violent behavior, because I believe that it directly does cause violent behavior because the person is in such a desperate, hyped up state trying to seek more. And I have seen it destroy. I know from personal experience, having a father who was on it for 30 years, that it is very destructive, and that it basically shuts down a person's conscience. Violence is not really a significant part of the problems created by the hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD or mescaline, nor do they cause a significant amount of the violence associated with drug use. Most of the violence associated with the use of illegal drugs is caused by the fact that the drugs have been made illegal, as a result of which their economic value has been greatly enhanced. One could even say subsidized by the government. And in countries where drugs have been legalized, it shows that the rates of usage actually go down, as does the crime level. So, there's an enormous and extraordinarily lucrative market in these drugs, which, since they are illegal, cannot be regulated in the normal, peaceful way that markets for illegal commodities are regulated, that is, by the government. As a result of this, the drug dealers engage in extremely violent wars with each other to gain control over as much of the market as they can. That is what causes the vast majority of the violence associated with illegal drugs. The drugs themselves are not causing the violence. The legal system is causing it. The war on drugs is causing it by precipitating drug wars between drug dealers. That is why the most effective way to prevent the violence associated with the use of illegal drugs would be to treat them as a problem in public health and preventative medicine, which they are, and provide treatment for those who are addicted to them and stop treating them as a criminal problem. Most of the violence associated with the illegal drugs would end tomorrow. The Colombian drug cartel and the inner city drug gangs would go out of business if we decriminalized those drugs today. Ironically, the only drug that has been shown to stimulate violent behavior, and study after study after study, through its psychopharmacological effects on brain and behavior, is the one that is legal: alcohol. And the most dangerous drug of all, without any close competitors, the drug whose very use is an act of violence, since it kills both those who use it and those whom they expose to it, and kills incomparably more people than are killed in the gang wars precipitated by the illegal drugs, is another legal drug: tobacco. So the net effect of the drug laws has been to outlaw the drugs that prevent violence, legalize the ones that cause violence, legalize the other one whose use is an act of violence, precipitate violence over the sale of the illegal but violence preventing drugs, subsidize an illegal drug industry, which as a result is powerful enough to destabilize several fragile third world countries, exacerbate the AIDS epidemic, and so on. Clearly, repealing these laws and providing treatment rather than punishment would be one of the most important and effective steps we could take in the secondary prevention of violence. The Rand Corporation, for example, found that the treatment of heavy users of drugs reduced serious crimes against both persons and property 10 times as much as conventional law enforcement did, and 15 times as much as mandatory minimum sentences. So treating it as a public health problem, and studies have shown that treating it as a public health problem is much more effective. And not surprisingly, treatment was also vastly more effective in reducing cocaine consumption than either conventional law enforcement or mandatory minimum sentences. And I'm going to stop here at chapter 7. And I will continue on with Violence Prevention Educational 9 at a later date. Thank you very much for your time and listening.